Lecture 9. A Case of Leadership and Governance. In this lecture, a notion of democratic leadership and cultural perspectives of Assembly members are analysed in relation to sources of path dependency in the Welsh Assembly. Individual Assembly members are posed a number of questions concerning culture and leadership related to the role of the Assembly and its relationship with civil society and the people of Wales in general. Through an assessment of cultural development, this paper investigates governance procedures and individual action in a new and evolving institution. Two sets of interviews and surveys provide perspectives of the Assembly in relation to the evolving institutional structure, leadership capability and culture. This lecture draws on path dependency, democratic leadership and culture to identify how the Welsh Assembly mediates political difference and considers whether interpretations of the institution, leadership and policy formation are formed through self-reflective Institutions involve formal and or informal procedures, routines, norms and conventions which are embedded in structure and polity. These range from rules embedded in the Constitution to accepted conventions or informal agreements. Path dependency means that ideas incorporated in the formation of an institution are endogenous to present and future decisions. Institutions only change in relation to past decisions. Change is path dependent in that initial choices determine later developments, and once a particular pathway has been selected, alternatives tend to be ruled out thereafter. Path dependency may obscure dissensus that may exist beneath the surface of a program or organisational field and thus produce some neglect or forces of change. Studies need to assess the actions of individuals because small choices in the institutional arrangements can have remarkable consequences at a later date. Commentators have argued that historical institutionalism has weak assumptions of agency and tends to ignore the importance of actors in the process of maintaining the path. Once path dependency is realised through policy, agency or a synthesis of both, there are opportunities for departures from a particular pathway through critical junctures. When substantial institutional change takes place, thereby creating a branching point from which a historical development moves on to a new path. Bulmer and Birch 2001 take this idea further and make a distinction between critical moments and critical junctures. A critical moment is a potential critical juncture, however it may simply be part of the ongoing path dependency. A critical moment is when an opportunity arises for significant change. Such opportunities may not be realised and exploited, but if they are, the outcome is a critical juncture, at which point there is a clear departure from previous established patterns. Distinctions between societal, organisational and individual levels need to be taken into consideration if we are to identify and understand how institutions fit together and how path dependency operates in relation to critical moments and junctures. Institutional analysis allows us to examine the relationship between political actors as objects and agents of history and provides the theoretical bridge between men who make history and the circumstances under which history is made. Williams, 1991, argued that leaders as cultural producers organise or are organised in social institutions. He considered that institutions existed in specific cultural environments and as cultural producers had an impact on wider social structures. Shine, 1996, considered leadership and culture to be elements of an institutional process through which behaviour is transformed and refined over time. Behaviours are passed on through the organisation and provided accepted values and norms for new recruits and ongoing decision making as well as daily interaction. Consequently, leadership and culture are intrinsic for an institution because it defined or influenced norms and behaviour. Trice and Bayer, 1984, argued that culture incorporated the system of publicly and collectively accepted meanings operating for a given group at a given time. In such a way, values and beliefs are both created by and revealed to members of an organisation and those with whom they interact. Separate institutions can encompass different types of culture which reflect their particular history and circumstances of definitive groups within the organisation. Studies and theoretical concerns have moved beyond structure in terms of authority, rules and rational choice and emphasised values, norms, assumptions and beliefs. Indeed, values, norms, assumptions and beliefs that may be identified in wider social situations and historical process are usually essential when understanding the relationship between leadership and culture. Human beings are suspended in webs of significance and they themselves have spun. I take culture to be those webs and the analysis of it to be therefore not of an experimental science in search of laws, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. Goetz, 1993, page 5. We may further argue that webs of significance, meaning, and wider social specific values relating to historical process can be identified in Welsh politics, which incorporate ideals relating to community and democratic accountability. Indeed, we may take this further and argue that as an institution that embodies Welsh leadership, the Assembly reflects these values in policy making or in the context of a cultural producer. Shine, 1996, argued that we must not confuse the individual assumptions of the leader with the shared assumptions that define the concept of culture. Culture only arises when those individual assumptions lead to shared experiences that solve the group's problems of external survival and internal integration. Culture is created by shared experience, but it is the leader or leaders who initiate this process by imposing his or her beliefs, values and assumptions at the outset. The function of leadership in a democratic context are those acts that assist the group in achieving desired outcomes and ensure behaviours that sustain the democratic process. The main function of the democratic leader is to ensure maximum involvement and participation of every member in group activities and in the determination of objectives. Leadership is about the dispersion rather than concentration of responsibility. Nagel, 1987, goes further and considered that democratic leadership should not simply ensure authority dispersion but remind people that they have collective responsibilities. They are responsible for the democracy. Pre-devolution Wales lacked an institutional focus, and culture was built on factors such as language, religion and education, and relied on churches, chapels, schools and associations. With the realisation of devolution, it was possible that the Welsh Assembly could provide a coherent institution for reinforcing culture and identity. See Howell, 2003, 2007, 2009. Considerations regarding the Welsh Assembly as embodying leadership in the form of cultural producer can be ascertained from studies undertaken by a number of political scientists and historians. See Barry Jones and Balsam, who argued that even though the institutional culture in Wales was ahead of individual attitudinal change, a new civic culture was developing. Wyn Jones and Tristan, 1999, considered that the legitimacy of the Welsh Assembly would depend on its ability to translate the rhetoric of inclusiveness into reality through incorporating all of Wales. Historical texts produced by Davis, 1990, Evans, 1981, Williams, 85 and Williams, 71 also raised concerns regarding the role of an assembly in relation to Wales. For example, Davis, 1990, considered that through the growth of a political institution, the Welsh would find their voice and define themselves. In 2004, the Richard Commission investigated the rationale for devolution and the direction development should take, or the development in 2004, the Richard Commission investigated the rationale for devolution and the direction it should take or could take in relation to this. Ron Davies, who was Secretary of State for Wales at the time of devolution, argued that it was about having a system where information, power and decision making would be shared. It was based on proportionality so that the elected representatives from all parties in Wales would be included. It was based on the idea of partnership. The construction was therefore an inclusive assembly, a unique model of government designed for the particular circumstances here in Wales. The idea of a corporate body was more reassuring to people who didn't want to go down the parliamentary road. There were two arguments in the Labour Party, those who wanted a parliament for Wales and those who did not. The assembly was the compromise and the corporate body provided reassurance. However, since the inception of the Welsh Assembly, we have an institution that tries to act as a parliament but isn't constructed to act as such. The problem we have now is that we created a stepping stone, and I think everybody realised that this is only a stepping stone. The next logical step is a parliament, not to start compromising again and create another stepping stone before we get to the final stepping stone. That was was Ron Davis, speaking at the Richard Commission in 2004. The outcome of a recent referendum regarding primary powers re-emphasises this point. However, the Assembly still falls short of a fully formed Parliament. Values such as accountability, democracy and inclusiveness were the basis of arguments for the Assembly and underpinned the cross-party path dependency or cultural perspective outlined in the Democratic Declaration in 1994. The Declaration was approved by a constitutional conference of 250 people who represented local authorities, political parties, trade unions and churches in Wales. Osmond, 1995, wrote that the conference registered a landmark in Welsh politics. A strong intellectual case for legislative and financial powers for a parliament was made, as well as internal democracy in elections and procedures. Indeed, important areas for the declaration were an elected parliament, cultural diversity, gender balance, responsibility, and greater democracy in terms of electoral procedures and representation. Issues linked to those identified in the declaration may be seen in discussions and papers that informed the Richard Commission 2004, as well as its outcomes and the Government of Wales Act 2006. The data collected, that is the interviews and surveys, provided evidence of path dependency, leadership and institutional culture in the Welsh Assembly. In the first survey, a set of interviews, concepts such as transparency, inclusiveness were more vigorously adhered to than in the second survey and set of interviews. These concepts still constituted underlying values and beliefs in these terms, but the realities of government had diluted these ideals. These were written into the initial legislation to ensure devolution and accepted by the initial leaders of the Assembly. However, individual assumptions and shared experiences in relation to internal integration and external survival led to a culture not entirely based on the initial leaders' individual assumptions, but negotiated assumptions that ensured politics and leadership for Wales. Indeed, path dependency is apparent in terms of some taken for granted shared basic assumptions as they emerged from the research participants. The Assembly incorporated an institution which provided the Welsh people with a symbol, an institution where the focus is the representation of the people of Wales that reflected and or constructed cultural perspectives through the democratic values it embodies. It involves an entity that provides democratic leadership for the Welsh people.